Elves and the Shoemaker. Retold by Eric Subin. Once upon a time, there was a kind shoemaker. Though he worked very hard, he grew poorer and poorer. At last he had only enough leather left to make one more pair of shoes. One winter night he cut the leather out for shoes, but he was too tired to go any further. He left the leather on the workbench and decided to stitch the shoes together the next morning. The shoemaker went to bed, not knowing what he and his wife would do once the leather was used up. They had no money to buy more. Despite their troubles, the shoemaker and his wife slept soundly that night. Early the next morning, the shoemaker woke up and he got dressed, and he went to a shop to make his last pair of shoes. Once he sat down at his workbench, the shoemaker thought he must be dreaming. He blinked his eyes. He blinked them again. But it was not a dream. On the very spot where he had left the leather the night before, there was a pair of beautiful, well-made shoes. All finished. He called his wife into the shop and showed her the shoes. "They're splendid," she exclaimed. "But when did you make them?" "I didn't make them," the shoemaker replied. "I found them here this morning." The shoemaker put the shoes in the window, hoping that someone would buy them. Soon the door swung open, and a fine gentleman walked into the shop. "I must have these wonderful shoes," he said. "I've never seen anything like them. The stitches are so small and delicate." The shoemaker sold the shoes to the gentleman, who paid a very high price for them. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. Then he had enough left over to buy a soup bone for dinner. That night, the shoemaker cut out the leather. He was very hungry, and he could smell the soup his wife was cooking. "I'll bet make these shoes tomorrow," he said, and he went to eat his dinner. Next morning, he found 2 pairs of elegant shoes on his workbench. He showed them to his wife. "Who can be making these marvelous shoes?" she said. The shoemaker just shook his head in wonder. Once again, the shoemaker placed the shoes in the window. He didn't have to wait long before the door swung open. This time, there were 2 customers, and they both paid handsomely for the fine shoes. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather for 4 more pairs of shoes. Things went on this way for some time. Every night the shoemaker cut the leather and went to sleep. And every morning he found more beautiful shoes on his workbench. The shoemaker and his wife were no longer poor. They sewed so many pairs of shoes that little by little they began to save some money. One evening, the shoemaker said to his wife, "It's nearly Christmas, and we still don't know who is sewing all these shoes for us. We cannot go another day without finding out who it is." So together, the shoemaker and his wife thought of a plan. Instead of going to sleep that night, they hid behind a curtain in the shop. At midnight, two tiny elves skipped through the door into the room. The shoemaker and his wife watched in amazement as the elves quickly began to stitch and sew. Soon the bench was filled with handsome new shoes. But the moment their work was finished, the elves vanished. The shoemaker and his wife were astonished. They decided they must do something for the tiny creatures who had been so kind to them. The elves were not wearing any coats or hats or shoes, said the wife. The poor little things must get very cold this time of year. So the shoemaker and his wife made two tiny suits of clothing for the elves. The next night, they laid the little clothes they had made on the table. Then they hid behind the curtain once again. Just at midnight, the elves came into the shop. When they saw the clothes, they were overjoyed. They hurried to try on their outfits and found that everything fit them perfectly. In their brand new clothes, the elves danced around the room and sang a merry song. At last, the elves danced out the door of the shoemaker's shop, never to return again. The thoughtful shoemaker and his good wife had repaid kindness with kindness. They never wanted for anything, and they lived happily for the rest of their lives. This is the shoemaker, the elves, and the shoemaker.